All right. So, thank you everybody for coming out this morning. I saw that had Auditorium 1. I was like, wow, that must be cool now. I get the big room. I was like, but I get it first thing in the morning when everyone's asleep. So, so on that note, yellow feedback forms. The feedback on the SCED website seems like it's mostly for the event. Um, But if you fill this out, it's for the class. So hopefully, if I get some good feedback forms, I'll get a better time slot next year. But this is still great, still awesome. So thank you everybody for being up early in the morning to come talk about Avatar. So most of you are probably bigger Avatar fans than I am. Like, I really love the show. I think it's great. But when it first came out, I was wrapping up college, and so I only got to see a handful of episodes. In fact, I saw so few episodes that when I saw the live action movie, I did not realize how bad it was. I did still understand that Avatar the Last Airbender was way better than that goofy blue people Avatar that's mostly just a Fern Gully ripoff. Um, since then, I initially watched Legend of Korra, but then during the pandemic was able to binge all of Avatar and the parts of Legend of Korra that I hadn't seen. So now I'm caught up. I've also seen that Netflix series and then re-binged to catch up with this. Now, not being as immersed in Avatar as a lot of people in our culture, it might be a question: why am I teaching about Avatar? Well, one, the series is just beautiful. It's wonderful. And originally, I had wanted to teach a class about learning about animism from fiction, partially because when animism was starting to pick up in the magical community and the occult community is something people talked about, probably about in the last 10 to 15 years or so, there was a big uptick in that. There were a lot of like podcasters and teachers who they were like really reifying the concept of animism and making it overcomplicated and talking about it in ways that to me almost kind of built a wall up from being able to really engage the concept. And I heard Vanessa Williams sing Colors of the Wind and was like, this teaches animism better than like every occult and witchcraft teacher out there trying to make it this big intellectual thing. And so looking at the idea of teaching it from fictional sources, I realized the problem with that is everyone has to be familiar with the fictional sources you're using. And so a lot of the class would be covering what those different sources say. But Avatar is one that most people have seen. And by focusing on that one, people can decide, like, oh, I've seen that show, I'm going to come to that. So it seemed like a really good opportunity for that. The problem is there's a lot of Avatar material, and a lot of the episodes go into really cool stuff. So I'm only going to be able to cover things from a couple episodes, and I decided to stick with season one for this. But I will probably go back and re-binge seasons 2 and 3 and Korra, and then do classes for those that I'll just put online for free for people. So um, if you use the QR codes there to follow stuff with me, you'll see those when they come up. I'll also have some paper here at the end where people can write down their email addresses if you want me to send you when I post the audio from this class as well as the upcoming ones. So we should probably start off by talking about what animism is, which is going to lead inevitably to falling into that trap that all like the teachers and podcasters and everybody were falling into. Now, personally, I've always been an animist, but I wouldn't have always used that term. So when I was growing up, a lot of the occult community was very focused on archetypes and uh, sort of pop versions of psychoanalysis and psychodynamics. And you didn't see a lot of directly addressing spirits or directly addressing the living world. Everything was filtered through kind of these very intellectual models of energy or of icons or images as opposed to directly engaging spirits. And I hated that because I was directly engaging spirits before I was reading magic books. And I know a lot of people, particularly people who end up in the witchcraft areas of occultism have that experience. And so there were definitely a lot of people who had that natural animism. But a lot of people who didn't have that kind of were like, whoa, this is this discovery. We were all looking for all this stuff and we were doing all this chaos magic, but we should have just been animists. And even for those of us who were kind of always immersed in that experience, the idea of describing ourselves as animist wasn't going to be obvious, because the old language of animism in academia was mostly for deriding people who were animists. And it presented animism as this bad, superstitious, silly concept of people who couldn't understand the world, to the point where eventually anthropologists were like, we got to stop being jerks and looking down on these people we're studying. Maybe we just shouldn't use the word animism at all anymore. But then some new phases and developments in anthropology found that the word could still be useful. And so looking at some of the older definitions, they pointed to animism as a general primitive stage of religious development. They were very vague in some of the initial definitions, to the point where you could almost say any religion was animistic, regardless of what stage of development it was in. And they kind of looked at it as primitive people not being able to distinguish between animate and inanimate objects because they lacked the comprehension and mental faculties to do so. So obviously no one should be using that as a starting point, and no one's going to adopt being that. But again, it was them sort of overcomplicating the idea as a way of trying to categorize things maybe a little bit too definitively, as well as from kind of a bigoted standpoint. New animism definitions are still debated and also overcomplicate things. They tend to approach from perspectives outside of an animist perspective and try to view animism based on a more Western or really Anglophone materialist perspective. But you do have some anthropologists now coming from indigenous backgrounds where they have been exposed to more of a natural awareness of animism and are reshaping some of those definitions. To me, the key concepts from anthropology about animism are that animism is inherently relational. It's concerned with the relationships between those who exist, and not necessarily with categorizing or characterizing what makes something have personhood. By recognizing that many personhoods and forms of self outside of the specific human understanding of those forms can exist, we can understand that those different forms of self and those different types of personhood can relate to each other in a context that doesn't have to be externalizing or inherently dualistic. It doesn't have to be about, okay, we exist in this way and we understand ourselves this way, and so we're this identity, and these animals exist in this way and they're that identity, and these other things that people would generally think of as inanimate, they're still animate, but they're really different animate, and so they exist that way. It's really more, I can interact with these animals, I can interact with these people, I can interact with these plants, I can interact with these stones, and I can have relationships with all of those things where we share and the relationship can go both ways. There's a way that I can get something from this interaction, they can get something from this interaction, and I can have some sort of meaningful communication or relationship with them just like I would with other people, because, as one of the other classes this weekend is titled, everything is a person. I think even in kind of discussing it that way and describing how it differs from other concepts of animism, it still sort of reifies the concept in some unnecessary academic ways. More simply, animism is a recognition that life exists abundantly in the world, and that much of that life has personhood in myriad ways without needing to define or understand that based on our comprehension of intellect, so much as our experience of relationships and communicative interactions with the various entities that exist around us. If you really want to understand it in a less wordy fashion, though, listen to Colors of the Wind, and the lyrics are in your handout packets. So for Avatar, the core magic that we see in Avatar is bending. Bending isn't animism. So we'll talk a little bit about bending, but not a whole lot specifically around bending. It is the magic of that universe, though. In the first episode and several other times, Sokka refers to it as magic. Katara tends to dismiss it when he refers to it as magic. But the series doesn't really depict any other forms of magic in their universe aside from bending, and the couple times you see some stage magic. The creators of the show have referred to it as magic, though. And they talk about when they developed the ideas around how bending would work in universe, they wanted something that wasn't fully just about it being this inherent superpower. They wanted something where people had to learn to use it. There had to be ways that they used it that were sort of fixed. And they wanted a type of structure to it where there was like a rationale. But they still understood it as the magical part of their world building. Bending isn't animism because it doesn't really directly involve spirits or spirit interaction. In Legend of Korra, we start to see that there is more of a spirit relationship with bending because you have the lion turtles giving bending to the various nations, the Avatar being based on an ongoing spirit relationship. But we don't see a lot of that in Avatar the Last Airbender. We do see that bending has spiritual elements to it. And one of the really interesting avenues to explore is the difference between benders who are spiritual and those who are not. Unfortunately, a lot of that is more season 2 and season 3, so that'll come in future classes if you listen to those online. But for the most part, bending won't be our focus today. The first thing that is going to be our focus are angry spirits. And so this is part of what led me to want to talk about Avatar in general. Back in 2018, I released my first book, Living Spirits, A Guide to Magic in a World of Spirits. And I thought I was being super brilliant and innovative in this one section of the book where I talked about how if you look at spirits in certain areas of folklore, you can see spirits who are sometimes depicted as really positive and helpful to the community, and they're almost like guardians or guides or kin to the community. But then those same spirits will be depicted as dangerous, monstrous spirits to be avoided in other stories. And looking at that, it made me think about how we have spirits described in paranormal stories and urban legends where they seem to often be tied to natural features or types of places, and they always seem to be agitated, like there's something wrong. And what I realized is probably those spirits were originally spirits that would have been normal folklore spirits in the place. Spirits that were guardian or kinship spirits that become angry were going through the same thing that these paranormal spirits go through. And it's that humans can be crap neighbors, especially as we cut ourselves off from the spirit world and as we lose our awareness of that animistic reality, that there's personhood to things outside of ourselves, and that what we do impacts other living creatures within our world. And so those spirits have to defend themselves, they have to defend the places where they reside, and they become antagonistic to the humans that are damaging those places, or the humans that aren't maintaining good relationships with them that were maintained in the past. And when I wrote this, I was like, oh, I've never seen anyone talk about this before. This is really cool. And then like 2 years later, I watched Avatar the Last Airbender, and I was like, they did a whole episode about this. This is a huge theme in the series. And they did this back in 2005 when like most magic people weren't even thinking about animism. So I was like, that's kind of taking the wind out of my sails a little bit, but it's really cool and is worth exploring. So we're going to start with Heibai in season 1, episode 7, The Winter Solstice, part 1. So in that episode, Aang, Sokka, and Katara, they're riding on Appa, and they see a scorched area of forest. And they describe it as the land looking like it has a scar, which I think is just a great description for that type of damage that can be done sometimes when we're not thinking about the environment or protecting the environment. And the animation on it is great because just watching it, you feel that sadness. You feel the impact of seeing that damage to this beautiful world. And so they fly down to see what's going on. Aang is absolutely distraught. He's just sitting on the ground. Katara asks if he wants to be cheered up, and he says no. Like, he's not the happy, bubbly, friendly Aang that we see all the time. And so Katara starts throwing acorns at him and Sokka, and they're like, wow, how is this going to cheer me up? And so Katara says, these acorns are everywhere, Aang. That means the forest will grow back. Every one of these will be a tall oak tree someday, and all the birds and animals that lived here will come back. So not only is that like a really nice message of hope and a nice message about kind of the cycle of life, you've got parts of it about how small things grow into mighty big things, and that things that can be little actions that we do can have huge impacts. There's a lot that can be unpacked there. Uh, the episode progresses. They find out that the local village has been tormented by spirit, the black and white spirit, and that spirit is taking people away, and they don't know what to do. And so this is where we first see that Aang is the bridge between the human world and the spirit world. And Aang doesn't really know what to do about that or how to deal with that. Through the episode, he goes on a spirit flight. He meets Fang, Avatar Roku's dragon, and Avatar Roku's dragon helps him learn that he's got to go talk to Avatar Roku and how to deal with Heibai. Before I go into analyzing it, just so why is Heibai attacking the villagers? The villagers didn't destroy the forest. Presumably the Fire Nation did. It means it's burned. They don't actually ever address that that's what happened, but I think it's supposed to be assumed by the audience because we see the Fire Nation committing that kind of destruction throughout the series. And in that concept of benders that are spiritually engaged versus benders that aren't, we don't always see that spiritual engagement through the benders in general that we see through the series, particularly with the Earth Kingdom. We don't see a lot of that. We see it more with like the White Lotus Masters. And it's kind of implied that most of the Air Nation has that spirituality. And a lot of the Water Tribe seems to have a connection with spirits that the other places don't have. But the Benders aren't necessarily shown as deeply spiritual all the time. The Fire Nation specifically does seem to be representative of that modern industrialism and materialist focus, a military industrial focus that removes people from that connection of the world. And we'll get to that a little bit more when we talk about Zhang Zhang and Commander Zhao. So the Fire Nation destroyed the forest, but from Heibai's perspective, it's still humans. It's still humans not there protecting the land that they should have a symbiosis with. It's still humans not tending to it or fixing the problem, and it was humans that came in and destroyed it. And so Heibai goes from being a peaceful spirit that the villagers have a connection with to being a dangerous spirit that wants to attack the villagers, take the villagers away, and punish them as he just basically screams and expresses his pain and his rage. There's sort of an implication that he feels that pain that the forest has felt through its destruction and is expressing that through his rampage. We see that the village elder is aware of the spirit connections in the spirit world. He's the first one that tells Aang that he's the bridge to the spirit world. And so that reflects that there are people in the regular world, not just the great bending masters, who have these connections with the spirit world and understand that there's connections with the spirit world. We see that there was a shrine for Heibai, and so it's implied that the villagers did have a relationship with him at one point, but that relationship's broken at this point. We don't see the villagers out there fixing the shrine. The villagers aren't out there tending to the shrine. They're aware that there's a spirit for the forest. They don't even seem to necessarily be aware that the black and white spirit is the spirit of the forest, though. There's no indication that the shrine is active. And there's no indication that they have any intermediaries within their community to facilitate that interaction either. They're waiting for the Avatar to come and facilitate this interaction. And the Avatar's been gone for 100 years. So we might assume that part of why we don't see a lot of connection between the benders or the community and the spirit world is that the person who was the main icon for that interaction is gone. And that's something we can kind of think about in our own communities. Most communities have spirit intermediaries. Witches historically, not so much what we use the word witch to describe today. Witches tended to be more antagonistic outsider figures, but witches were liminal figures who were frequently described in ways where it's almost like, is this a spirit we're talking about, or is this a person we're talking about? Witches were people who were natural bridges between the human world and the spirit world. They had one foot on each side. Shamans, priests, other types of magicians frequently also were that bridge. Goetes in Greek sorcery, they were partially connected with the world of the dead, partially connected with the world of the living. We see this in cultures that have active forms of shamanism through the Arctic Circle and through Northern Asia, where they are people who there is something about them that makes them somewhat different, and so they're able to interact with the spirit world more fluidly and more easily, and so they serve that function within the community. Any person might have times where they interact with the spirit world if they go to special places, if they do special things, if there's some sort of event that catalyzes it or makes it easier for them. But usually there's people who facilitate that specifically. And even in a community of magicians and pagans and spiritual people, most of you can probably think about people where you've gone to rituals that they've led, or you've been in groups in a community or gone to major events. And there's certain people where they kind of tend to be the people who facilitate those relationships and bring those relationships a little more than necessarily everyone else does. There are people who are a little bit more on that side of the fence and bring pieces of that side of the fence over for everyone else, or help bring people into that space on the other side of the fence. And that's kind of the Avatar's job. And we get the implication that there may have been other people in the communities in the Avatar world that did that, but they're maybe not as around anymore. And so there's no one there to deal with Heibai and soothe Heibai and try to make sure that things are okay with him. The shrine shows us that he's not a monster. We see him as a monster, just like the villagers do, but he's like a cute bear in his shrine statue. So we can see that there was a side to him that was this nice, friendly, protective kinship spirit before. When they're talking about how to deal with him, Aang says, I don't want to fight him. Aang recognizes that, like people, spirits need acceptance, healing, forgiveness, and compassion. And that's, again, one of those core lessons of actual animism, that it's about relationships. It's about these relational concepts where we have respect for things other than ourselves, things that don't necessarily look like us, don't necessarily act like us, that we recognize that they have value, they have personhood, they have agency, and that they have that same dignity that deserves respect that we do. Aang doesn't treat spirits as different or less than people because he's there for all persons, not just the humans in the different nations. Aang's actions result in healing Heibai, so he's able to become a spirit ally. He basically repeats back to Heibai what Katara told him about the acorns and how the forest would regrow. And he reassures Heibai that things will be okay. And we see Heibai transition back into that panda spirit, and he releases the people that were captured once Aang soothes him. Again, we saw Aang experience similar sorrow and pain about the forest to that which Heibai experienced. And once Heibai is an ally, we see him helping Aang later on. Before we get to him helping Aang later on, though, when Aang fixes the situation and people praise him for it, he acknowledges that he isn't responsible on his own for resolving the situation. He recognizes that he had help from Katara and he had help from Fang. And I think this is something where we might not immediately think of that as something related to animism. But Aang isn't fixated on himself or his own ego. And in the occult world, we kind of get weird about the concept of ego. Like we think like, oh, we shouldn't have ego. And ego just means I in Latin. It's just the word for yourself. And so yeah, you're going to have ego. Everyone is going to have ego. You have to have a self. But what we see with Aang is that that self is also relational. It's not just about him or about him recognizing his own greatness or his importance in the situation. He was able to solve the situation because of his relationships with others and because he brought that relationship to someone else who needed it. He included Heibai in that cycle of community that he had with Katara and Fang. And again, that takes us back to that core concept of how we engage in animistic world more holistically, and in a way where we can help bring that animistic experience more fully into the forefront of our world today. Later in the series, once Heibai is an ally, he confronts another spirit that is rude to Aang. And we see him kind of shift back into the black and white spirit. And so it indicates again that spirits are dynamic. They are not unifunctional. They're not always going to behave one way or another. They're going to behave in kind with the behavior that they experience because, again, they're people. They have relationships. They have experiences that happen in connection with others. And so they're going to respond to those experiences in a way that makes sense for that experience. So we see Heibai being able to still be the black and white spirit, but we also see that now it's motivated by his appreciation of Aang and his connection with Aang. In addition to defending Aang there, he also helps Aang get back to where he needs to be in the spirit world, and he sends Aang back into the physical world. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about kind of spirit guides and spirit helpers. But the defense that he gives to Aang, Aang's not in any danger. The monkey spirit just kind of mocks Aang and is happy that Aang is gone. And Heibai's just annoyed at his rudeness. But he's not attacking Aang. He's not dangerous for Aang. But it still illustrates the ability of spirits to advocate for us in the spirit world. And so how many people have like relationships with their ancestors or do ancestor work? So that's something that, again, has become super popular in the last several years. But before there was more of an attention to animism, you didn't see that as much in modern pagan and neo-pagan and occult spaces that weren't driven by a connection to living spirit traditions. But ancestors are a really great way of illustrating that advocacy because they're spirits that, if you're familiar with the work of Chris Bradford, he once said they have skin in the game. They care because you are that next step from them. They also know what it's like to be human. There are other spirit allies you can have that will also advocate for you. And so if you're trying to do something where you're connecting with a spirit that is not one you've had experience with, or not one that you have a cultural connection with, or just one that you're not particularly familiar with, or one that for some reason is somewhat antagonistic, or even maybe it's willing to work with you and it's working with you, but it doesn't understand how to. Having friends on the other side, to go with the Frog Princess. I've never seen that movie, but I've heard the song. That can be useful because those spirits can turn up for you if you have a good relationship with them and they extend that relationship to others. They can be like, hey, bro, this human's pretty cool. Be nice to them. Or, dude, humans don't eat flowers, so it's great that you're helping their garden grow, but help their crops grow too. They can kind of direct things that other spirits might not understand about the human world. That is also a good transition to our next topic, which is ancestors. So the clearest way that something ancestral shows up in the world of Avatar is the Avatar cycle, which, again, Legend of Korra dives more into what the Avatar cycle is, But we see the basic blueprint of it in Avatar the Last Airbender. We don't see a lot about how ancestral connections impact regular people. And the Avatar cycle isn't exactly an ancestor setup in a conventional fashion. Um, what we do see in the series is that familial bonds and behavior honoring those familiar bonds is very important. Um, Ozai, maybe not someone we're going to use as a great example for behavior connected to being spiritual or the reflection of how that behavior or how that connection changes behavior. But Ozai is driven by continuing the work of Fire Lord Sozin. He's still doing something that is relatively a form of ancestor work, even if it's mostly kind of a filial piety sort of ancestor work. Um, he's trying to emulate what he recognizes as his ancestors and what he recognizes was their will and they were trying to do. Zuko, not necessarily dealing with deceased ancestors, but his initial arc is about regaining his honor. And it's not just driven by his honor, it's driven by him wanting a relationship with his father. And so it's really easy to, in the first part of the series, pin Zuko down as this kind of one-note character. Once you kind of see his redemption arc, it's a lot easier to go back and see that he's not a one-note character even from the beginning, that there's a lot of depth and there's a lot of dynamism in terms of his behavior and his motivations even early on. But his attempts to regain his honor clearly are not about just being in a culture where honor is important. And later on, when we see more of what the Fire Nation outside of the upper echelons is like, they're just normal people. It's very tied to his status in the royal family, and it's very tied to the fact that he understands his father doesn't appreciate him, and that he lost that connection with his mother, and he wants a connection with his father. And there's a reflection in that of the fact that he wants to live up to what he thinks he's supposed to be based on who he comes from and who his ancestors were and what he did. And that's part of why Iroh is such an important character, because it gives him a different family member, a different elder to emulate and understand. And so he still has that connection, but he realizes that what he needs to strive for is still his honor, but his honor is predicated on very different things once he understands it based on his relationship with Iroh instead of based on the relationship he desires with his father. Sokka also trying to live up to the expectations of his father, or at least what he perceives those expectations to be. And I think that's one that's a little clearer from the beginning, that Sokka's father's expectations of him are not actually what Sokka thinks they are. A lot of what Sokka thinks he needs to do is his father kind of keeping him busy and his father showing him how to grow up and to be part of the community, but in a way that he can understand as a child. And that's where we see Sokka's growth over time, is that he kind of understands more of what that actually is as opposed to what he perceived it to be. Katara wants to continue by being a bender like her mother was. And she also emulates the strength and independence of her grandmother. So we see a lot of that where the main characters are very influenced by their connections to the previous generation and their connections to who they perceive as elders. And that doesn't necessarily have to be thought of as an ancestor work thing. Most children experience that. But kind of the depth of it and the way that it defines their actions throughout the show does show that sense of continuity with what came before you, and that you are an expression of that continuity, and there's a desire to be that expression. Aang does eventually get a moment in a later season that is a little bit more like what we conventionally think of ancestor work, where he's able to interact with Monkey Yatso in the spirit world. And so that's probably the most conventional moment that looks like ancestor work outside of the Avatar cycle. But the most things that we see that are comparable to what we would think of as connections with ancestors are Aang interacting with his past lives. But are these past lives? In Avatar the Last Airbender, they're treated as past lives, as if all the avatars were the same person reincarnated. In Korra, we learn that it's really Rava connecting with someone in each new generation and passing on the memories and the connections to those other spirits. So Aang probably was not the same person as Roku or Kyoshi or Kuruk or any of the other avatars. Aang is Aang. Aang has his own soul, his own personhood. But because of his connection with Rava, he has an ancestral connection with all of those other avatars, and a piece of them is still connected to him and inside of him, which is getting us closer to that concept of working with ancestors. A lot of times when people want to start off with ancestor work, they're concerned about, well, I was adopted. I don't know who my actual ancestors were, or my ancestors are really crap people, or my ancestors were all Christians that wouldn't like me doing this ancestor work. And there's a lot of answers you can give to all of those things. But one answer is that your ancestors don't have to be the people that you have a blood connection with. They can be people that you have community connections with. They could be people who you share affinities with, who were people who were pioneers in your profession or in something that's a driving factor in your life. And that's a little closer to what we see with the avatars. They all share this connection with Rava, and that's what links them. It's not that Aang is Roku's kid or something like that. So we can see in Avatar this reflection of the idea that the ancestors and the people you connect to aren't necessarily the people that you are linearly descended from. And again, in Korra, if I'm remembering right, Korra has an experience with Iroh in the spirit world. So we see that where even outside of the people in the Avatar cycle, that there are people who came before them that they're able to connect to in meaningful ways. The monks tell Aang, when they reveal that he's the Avatar, that he's going to meet someone special in the shrine of the temple, because they need him to go and interact with the previous avatars so he can learn more about being the Avatar. And when Aang goes into the spirit world, Fang shows Aang that he has to go to Avatar Roku's temple at the right exact time in order to speak with him. So the initial establishment of that ability to connect with those who came before, there's a special ritual space. There's special ritual conditions that open up the gateway to doing that. It's not something that he automatically has access to or automatically is able to engage, even though, as Roku says, that he's a part of Aang. And that's something that people today experience as well. Some people are very naturally gifted, and so you might naturally have connections with spirits. They may or may not be those ancestral spirits that you might want to connect with. If you're lucky, maybe they are. But for most people, at least early on, looking at special times of year, like Samhain or the winter solstice, those are times where things are malleable, times where things are permeable, and so you're able to engage in those interactions. Going through certain initiations, working through catabasis rituals to descend into the underworld, using special tools that connect you with the spaces of the dead, or going to special places like cemeteries or ossuaries or places where there are those links to the dead. That's usually how people have to start off with that. So they're illustrating that same idea that initial contact might take work. That initial contact might take going to a special place. It might take engaging in a special time or having special features there that allow you to have that contact. But once Aang has that contact, Roku says to him, I am part of you, and when you need to talk to me again, you will find a way. It's something that becomes easier. And that's the same thing that people today find as well. Maybe when you initially are trying to contact the dead or work with your ancestors, you go to a cemetery on Samhain and you make offerings to revivify them so that they are able to contact you. Maybe you take the Odysseus method and you go out and you dig a pit and put a bunch of offerings in the pit and then pour out blood and use your sword to hold off all the spirits that aren't supposed to be getting the offerings. But once you got it down and you have those connections, once you know the keepers of the dead and the people who can open the doors to them, then maybe all you're doing is putting out a glass of water and lighting a candle and talking to them. Maybe you're making dinner and serving a plate to an empty seat and having a real conversation with the person or persons who occupy that empty seat. And that's, again, going back to that actual understanding of animism. It's not just a cathartic activity. It's not just we're thinking about the dead far off. It's you're actually engaging them as persons who are there. There's an actual relationship there when you're talking with them. There's an expectation of presence and an expectation of the ability to have a real interaction. And with your ancestors, part of what makes it something that's easy to engage in those ways is, like Roku says, they're a part of you. There's some piece of them that continues in you. And that's not just your blood ancestors. Again, those ancestors where you've got some affinity, those ancestors where you have things that are shared between you and them, whether it's one of your teachers who's passed on, or the teacher of your teacher, or someone who pioneered something in the field that you're in. You share something with them because you have that knowledge that was passed along. You have those experiences that were passed along. You have connections to other people that had connections to them. And so there is some echo of them that's a part of you, and you're able to take the thread of that echo back to connect with them because they're part of you, because that relationship is there, and relationships are the key important element of all of this. Roku, later at the end of the conversation, activates the Avatar state, and he steps in to protect Aang by dealing with his enemies that are there to attack him. Roku essentially engages in full possession. So for those who maybe aren't familiar with possession work, there are multiple different layers or levels of possession. And so in Catholicism, where they pretty much only deal with apotropaic exorcism and possession only in like involuntary ways, they still recognize that you have obsession, possession, and obsession, infestation, and full possession, where like you might feel the presence of a spirit, you might think about the spirit, there might be some influence of the spirit. Then you have where the spirit might take over a little more or might control things a little more. And then you have where you're just gone and it's just the spirit. And you're kind of in the back seat going for a ride. And in cultures and communities where there's voluntary possession, where possession can be a very positive experience and a very necessary experience for the culture to engage with the spirit persons that it has relationships with, and for the culture to be able to navigate different issues that arise in the community, you have similar stages to that. You have stages where possession is like someone sitting next to you, maybe putting an arm around you, talking to you and communicating with you very closely. You have stages where maybe you're kind of in control, but that spirit's right in there telling you things directly, guiding you, leading your hand, but you still are the one making the decision. And then there are forms of possession where the spirit is full on taking over. It's speaking through you. It's guiding how you walk and move. People will be able to see that you're walking in ways or moving in ways that aren't normal to you. Your voice might seem different because it's not you at that point. And they illustrate that in a really cool way because everyone just sees Avatar Roku at this point. He just shows up as Avatar Roku. But so Aang experiences full possession in this case as Roku comes in. And that's really like taking us into another area of spirit work to talk about rather than just ancestor veneration, because normally your ancestors are not stepping in and like full on possessing you and running through whatever it is you're dealing with. But that doesn't mean your ancestors don't have an interest in helping you. It doesn't mean that they're not there, and it doesn't mean that they won't intercede for you. Their intercession might be more keeping something catastrophic from happening to you or giving you the resources that you need in order to deal with it. It might be something miraculously going your way all of a sudden because someone up there likes you and is looking out for you. But it could also be opening up capabilities that you didn't know were there. It might be that you're in a situation and you don't think you can handle something, and suddenly there's some voice telling you, this is how you handle it. You're able to handle this. This is how you do this. And that can be the mode that that intercession takes on. So that stepping in a pinch in order to kind of guide you through, that's something that is a realistic element that, again, is depicted in a very cool way there. He appears again to intercede for Aang, and this is much more conventional type of intercession that you have with the spirit. With Zhang Zhang, when Zhang Zhang doesn't want to teach Aang, Avatar Roku shows up and is like, dude, you're going to do this because I'm the Avatar. And so that looks a little bit more like the real world thing. We still see, like, suddenly they're not in Zhang Zhang's room and Roku's standing there where Aang was, and they have the conversation. And what that really reflects isn't so much like Aang is getting possessed and like something crazy miraculous is happening. It's reflecting that Zhang Zhang, as this like White Lotus master, is deeply spiritual, and he's able to perceive the spirit world, and he's able to have these experiences of the spirit world. And Roku's more sort of pulling him into this experience, this visionary moment at that point. But he's doing it because he's Aang's ally, and he needs to look out for Aang and make sure Aang has what he needs. The big moment in season 1 is obviously the Siege of the North. Now, the Siege of the North episodes, those were a couple episodes I did actually get to see when it first ran, when Avatar first aired. And they were so powerful and so amazing. Like, I was like, I need to get to sit down and watch this show at one point. And even in the crappy Avatar movie, the Siege of the North, particularly in the shrine for the water and moon spirit, the ocean and moon spirit, is still a very powerful scene. And there are a lot of things I think the Netflix series did wrong, but they did the Siege of the North really well. And you still get that power in what happens there. It's emotional. It's intense what's going on. And I think even for people who don't have a background in spirit work, who don't recognize the animistic nature of the world, that power and impact of that scene is really obvious, and really the whole pair of episodes. So again, we get the explanation that in this world there are spirits that relate to certain major things. There are great spirits that are important for the structure of the world. And the ones that we're dealing with here are the ocean spirit and the moon spirit. At the start of the battle, Arnuk, the Northern Water Tribe leader, calls upon the spirits to help them in the battle. So here we're seeing, again, a very conventional animistic culture element, where those spirits that are allied to a community or allied to a culture, that through prayer and petition, that culture turns to them when there's a time of need. It's sort of reflecting what that lifestyle is typically like. And that's something that's still going to be familiar to most people, even people who aren't from an animistic background, because contemporary religions still work that way. Even if the religion wouldn't view itself as animistic because the spirits or gods that they are petitioning are far off or somehow separate from creation, there's still that idea that it's like, hey, you're going to look to something. Even people who say they don't believe in any sort of God or any sort of spirits, they have times where things are intense and they're like, whatever's out there, help me. And so I think that's something we all get. But it's still illustrated there that in this culture, it's these spirits that specifically are connected to their tribe. Their tribe has a specific connection to the ocean and moon spirit, that's who they are turning to. This is the first place that we see them mentioned, but it also shows that they are very important to his people. It's also one of the first indications outside of Heibai that we see that regular people in the community have connections with the spirit world. Iroh notes that the water tribe gains power from the moon, and that the full moon is going to increase their power. So this can easily be read as a title reference, that the moon draws the tides and the moon kind of pushes and pulls the water, and so the water in the water nation's people is impacted by the moon, like how we talk about lunacy, or how we talk about people going wild when the moon's full because it impacts our bodies because our bodies are mostly water. But being a title reference doesn't necessarily eliminate that it's also an animistic concept. It reflects the idea that the moon and the ocean are actual beings who communicate with one another, that there's some relationship between the moon and the ocean, and there's some interaction between them which is natural to them. That communication also exists between the waterbenders and these particular spirits. Our strength comes from the spirit of the moon, our life comes from the spirit of the ocean. That's how Princess Yue describes their relationship with these spirits, that their very existence, not just their bending, but their life, is predicated on this relationship. And again, that reflects that our bodies are mostly made of water. It is true. Our life does come from the ocean and the waters of the world. But it also reflects our ability to relate to the balance of these spirits. Because we share a relationship with these spirits that is akin to the relationship that they share with each other, we partake of that relationship. And again, it goes back to that relational quality, that idea that it's about interaction. It's not about structure. It's not about, I'm going to categorize every spirit that's out there. It's not about, I'm going to pull out the Ars Goetia and look up a spirit in a book and see what its description is. It's about, I'm going to live in a world where my neighbor is this spirit and my other neighbor is this person. And I interact with them and I understand relationships with them and understand how that reflects my experience and how my actions reflect on their experiences. Zuko, when he's fighting Katara, says, "You rise with the moon, I rise with the sun." Which, if any of you saw my Facebook post last night trying to encourage people to come to this class, that was the line that I was referencing. So it reflects that even the Fire Nation understands that they have a relationship with the natural world. They have maybe instrumentalized that relationship in the extreme. They've maybe kind of cut out the spiritual awareness of that relationship for the most part. But they do recognize that there is some relationship with the natural world and it impacts them. And in later seasons, of course, we do see that the omnipresent fire that is the light of the sun is important to the Fire Nation's ability to firebend. Legends say the moon was the first waterbender. Our ancestors saw how it pushed and pulled the tides and learned how to do it themselves. And so this is one of the first places that we get the idea that there are things in the world that are instructive to benders. In season 2 and season 3, we get a lot of cool stuff about how bending is learned from different types of animals. And so for those of you who came in late, we're only talking about season 1 because there's so much stuff in Avatar. But I'm probably going to record classes on seasons 2 and 3, maybe on some of the Korra stuff, and just post them online for free. If any of you guys didn't get the handout packets, I have those, and those will have links where you can follow to see that stuff. And at the end, I'll also have where people can write down their email so I can send stuff out in the future once these are up. But this is one of the first places where we see the benders looking at the natural world and learning from the natural world. And while I love the Avatar wand story, and that was one thing that, for me, I was just like, I can't put these two things together at first. Did they get the bending from the lion turtles? Or did the badger moles teach the earthbenders how to bend? Where does bending come from? And one of my friends was like, it's not that hard. They get the ability from the lion turtles. They learn the forms and how to do it by watching these things in nature. Like, they go together. And it's like, oh, okay. So the idea of watching nature and emulating elements of nature is something that ties into anthropological ideas about animism and about shamanism. That we can look at spirit relationships in communities that prioritize them and see how a lot of the rituals of spirit relationships involve mimicking the community's understanding of what those natural things do. So rituals that have to do with relationships with the animal kingdom mimic the comprehension of the lifestyle and the actions of the animals. A lot of our agrarian cycle ideas in modern neo-paganism and in ceremonial magic, which if you aren't from a ceremonial magic background, that stuff's actually super important there too, particularly in the way that Thelema does things. In fact, that's how it kind of came into neo-paganism, is via that connection. But a lot of that stems from really bad anthropology in the late 19th and early 20th century. A lot of things stem from bad anthropology. But we can still see that in trying to think about what the rituals for Adonis, where they would do lamentations and put flowers on a pyre to recognize Adonis's death and return back in the ancient world, and the way that that influenced interpretations of Osirian mythology and interpretations of the Christ mythology and all these various mythologies where people are like, everything is a penis, and the penis is the sun, and the sun decides that the wheat's going to die, and then it's going to come back, and it's all the seed going into the fertile earth, and all that stuff that everybody thought, and that we have all these ideas built around now. Rituals that people do are mimicking what we think of as that process for what the sun does. They're mimicking what we think of as that process for the seed and plant cycle. We're doing things where we're doing very human things, but we're doing a human interpretation of what we think that those things do, so that we establish a relationship with them, and through that relationship encourage a positive and fecund relationship with the world around us. So that idea of mimicking and learning from nature, and then engaging in processes to influence our relationship with nature by showing kinship through interacting, through mimicry, essentially, is a very core part of how we understand ritual and how we understand human interactions with things that are beyond the surface level view of the world around us. And so the fact that the show kind of establishes that as how the benders learn bending is really cool, because I wouldn't be surprised if that's just something where they were like, wouldn't it be cool if they learned bending from watching things in the world, as opposed to them being like, all these anthropologists say that all our human rituals, they're based on us trying to mimic the things that we want to interact with. I think it's something where there's probably a naturalistic impulse to try to build a relationship that way. I mean, that's the way kids grow up. Kids grow up mimicking their parents, mimicking other older kids that they think are cool, mimicking things they see in television and media, because they're trying to establish relationships. That's part of how we survive, is we build relationships with those around us who will be able to support us and protect us. And then eventually we build relationships with people around us so that we aren't hostile to each other. But a lot of that relationship building is based on mimicry and based on trying to recognize what others are doing and do things that make us like those others so that we can interact. Going back deeper into the episode, there's the shrine for the moon and the ocean spirits. And really, again, all the beautiful, powerful stuff that's going on with the spirit connections in this episode really is in that shrine space. And the shrine space is illustrated so beautifully in the series. It's the center for all of the spiritual energy in the north. And that's one thing that I think is kind of cool with the Water Tribe, is while we think of like the air nomads as being really spiritual because they're these monks and they're in meditation all the time, and even in like the Avatar 1 story where it's like they're just kind of living on the clouds and living in a place where they couldn't get around without their airbending, and their temples are in places where, like Aang says, like you can only reach this place by riding a flying bison. Like you can only reach this place if you're able to airbend. They're very focused on that element of their culture. And it's the airbenders that we often see as the one who have that focus and that sort of priestly nature to be able to go into the spirit world and interact with the spirit world. And again, Korra illustrates a lot of this with Jinora and with like Tenzin being sort of jealous of Jinora naturally being able to connect with the spirit world. But the Water Tribe's all about the spirits. Again, in Korra, it's the Water Tribe leader that wants to bring spirits back into the regular world. Now he's a little diluted by a scary spirit there, but it's still something where it's deeply reflected in their culture in ways that we don't necessarily see it as easily in the other nations' cultures. So it's kind of a cool element of them. And so that makes it even more important that this shrine is the center of all of the spiritual energy of the North. That everything that the waterbenders experience, their connection to bending, is like sort of flowing from this shrine space that they protect underneath their kingdom. When Team Avatar gets down there, they note that it's unusually warm. They note that it's exceedingly tranquil. It has these special qualities to it that are immediately noticeable when they go into the space. And that's something where it's people a lot of times will talk about like, oh, it's so spiritual when I go into the forest. It's so spiritual when I'm at this park. And I think it's important for like not just animism, but for any type of spirituality that deals with engaging the world beyond just a material sense, that it's so spiritual when you're in this auditorium. It's so spiritual when you're walking through a parking lot. You have to be able to understand that there is life, that there is living existence within all spaces, not just the spaces that are visually magnificent, not just the spaces where we feel set apart and where we can take our attention away from the humdrum noise of the waking world and we're in a place where it's quiet so we can notice it. We need to get to where we can notice it everywhere. But that doesn't mean that there aren't spaces that are constructed, that there aren't spaces that are special nexus points where there is a deeper relationship with the spirit world. And that's what we're dealing with in this shrine. And in those spaces, there should be things that are immediately noticeable. And not necessarily immediately noticeable in the sense of, I feel so much more connected here because I can think, because I'm free to think about it. But more in the sense that the space feels physically different. That it feels like you are somewhere that is not normal. And that's something that comes up when people talk about ritual and magic, that you'll see things where people are like, oh, like, have you ever done something where you've like been in a ritual and like you've seen the spirit as if it was physically there, or where like this person seemed completely taken over by the spirit? And it's like, those things are cool. Those are the bells and whistles. But the temperature changes. The air feels like it has more pressure. There's more capacitance to it. You can feel the electricity in the air. Maybe things are kind of like moving slightly that shouldn't be moving slightly, or there's like weird noises, or just the space starts to groan as if like the building is settling, but it just doesn't stop settling. I had a really cool experience once where I was doing some stuff with reaching out to an angel at my ancestor shrine. And it was like my first time trying to incorporate those things directly together, as opposed to like having this one part of my spirituality and this other part of my spirituality. And when I got through all like the ancestor shrine prayers and everything and started to pray for the angel to be there to interact with, the power in my house went out. And then as soon as the interaction with the angel was done and the angel left, the power in the house came back on. It was really trippy. Also tend to get free food when working with that angel. That's a fun part. But that's kind of like bells and whistles. That's a little bit like magnificent. It doesn't have to be something big like that. It can be that there's a preternatural tranquility to where you are. It can be that the temperature is different. It can be that the air feels weird and prickly. And so that idea that these spaces where the spirits are different because there is a real presence, because this is a space that overlaps the spirit world, with the physical world. They all It always overlaps, but the idea that it's overlapping as a space that's more specially enfolded and where things are able to be perceived more directly, that's kind of the important part there. And we haven't seen a lot of religious setups related to the spirits presented in the series up to this point. We saw Heiba's shrine, but we never saw anything with like it being taken care of or people interacting with it. And so this reflects that cultural presence of an animistic worldview rather than simply being something that certain benders are selectively aware of. Which, again, throughout most of the show, it's like the White Lotus Masters, they're deeply spiritual, and everybody else doesn't realize that the spirit world exists. So it's kind of cool that we see this thing where it's like, no, this whole culture has this as part of their culture. And it's one of those things where being at an event like this, where you're in a community where it's not weird to be an animist. It's not weird to have had these experiences. Like the accepting in situations where it would be like inappropriate to openly talk about these sorts of things. I try to be relatively open about these things because that makes it easier for it to be something that's authentically part of my life. Something where I'm authentically engaged in it. And it's not like painting something on. It's not going in and saying, this moment is a moment where I am an animist or where I'm doing this thing, and then every other moment I'm just some dude. Like, I'm always just some dude, but I'm just some dude who is an animist. And so that's always something that should be reflected in my awareness of the world. That's that same idea of you should walk through a parking lot and recognize that there are things that are alive in the parking lot, just like you would in the forest. And so that's easier when you're in a space where there are a lot of people engaged with that. Whether they're people who are engaged with it all the time or people who are engaged with it when they're in spaces like that, it doesn't really matter. It's kind of creating that space where you're in a culture, you're in a community or a subculture where there's the ability to share that, there's the ability to recognize that. And while I've kind of used reification as something bad in describing how people overly intellectualized animism, this is a place where reification is good. This is a place where taking something and saying, this is a thing that exists and this is a thing that is part of me is a good thing. And having that community and that support and it feeling natural, you can kind of build that to where it becomes something that's natural when you're outside of those spaces as well. But it's a lot easier to start in those spaces where there's support for it, where there's other people that experience it along with you. That connection with the spirits is reflected again. Encore talks about how he prayed to the spirits to save Princess Yue when she was born. And the description of it is kind of weird. Like, it's not exactly like she was born dead. It's just she was born with all the features of being dead. And so I don't know if that's because it's like a kid's show or if it's supposed to be that like there wasn't a comprehension of being dead or not dead, or if it was sort of the idea of we don't have to categorize that way, that we don't have to say she was animate, she was inanimate. She was there. She was a person that they could relate to, whether she was breathing or not. And that relationship was still there, and it drove her father to turn to these spirits that are deeply important to their tribe and pray for help. And so it reflects, again, that reliance on the spirit world that we see with him turning to the spirits at the beginning of the battle, but also a comprehension that the spirits are approachable. And that idea of that reliance is another thing that is kind of important to touch on. You see a lot of things where people are like, okay, you don't want to rely on like turning to spirits for like these things in your life. You don't want to rely on magic or on spirituality or religion on things for your life. You've got to get out there and do the thing. You've got to hit the road, pound the pavement, do like the physical thing that gets it done. And even people who are saying these things are real and these things are important are creating a hierarchy that is artificial. They're saying that these things are only real when we're doing this thing, and they only have impact in the way they make us feel or the way they make us think about things. They don't have impact to actually get things done. They're not really part of the real world that we interact with. But if they are part of the real world, if these are relationships that we have on a continual basis, and they're real relationships just like relationships with everything else, then they're a real part of our real world. They're a real part of our lives. there are ways that having those relationships impact things that actually happen to us. Now, that's not saying if you're sick, pour out libations for Apollo and dream incubate by a lamp with Asclepius and make whatever traditional offerings are for Hygieia, and don't go to a doctor, don't go take medicine. It's saying that there's a value to doing those things as well. That there are times where sometimes those solutions are the only solution you're going to need. There are times where, and maybe I shouldn't have picked illness, because that's where like you run into like sketchy things. But there's going to be times in your life where those spiritual intercessions and remediations are things which can solve the issue you're dealing with, because sometimes those are the underlying cause of the physical thing that you're dealing with. Now, they can be the underlying cause of the physical issue that you have, and you can remediate the spirit part of it. But if that physical issue has developed to the point where there is a real physical issue, then it may be that there needs to be physical remediation of the issue also. But without remediating the spirit components of it, you kind of deal with the physical issue and then it comes right back. Or you do the things that should be dealing with it and it doesn't go away. So that's one of the adjustments of taking that idea and saying we have this relationship, and it's not about categorizing what's animate and what's inanimate. It's not about categorizing this is the space where we think about this thing, this is the space where we experience this thing, and these are the spaces where we don't. It's about looking at how they're interwoven and how there's a relationship between the spiritual factors and the spiritual causes and the physical factors and the physical causes. The spiritual accidents is really the word, but it's not how we use that word typically anymore. The spiritual manifestations, the things that are happening that we can perceive in the spirit world, and the physical manifestations of the things that are happening in the physical world. They all interlock and interweave with one another. And so that idea that the head of the water tribe, they've explored their physical options for saving Princess Yue. But in this situation that's an emergency, he's not like, well, this is an emergency. I can't turn to spirits. Spirits can't do anything about this. It's the obvious thing for him to do is to turn to the spirits. Now, it's a cartoon world. So they're immersed in a culture where that's what they do. They're immersed in a world where we know that magic is going to be super powerful and is going to work. So it's easy to take that approach. But you'll also find the more you weave that awareness that this is as real as anything else, and is as much something that you can experience and as much something that you can interact with in your life as anything else, you'll start to find that it's easier to have those interactions and that there's more of an impact in those interactions then. And it's not so much, I mean, I guess a lot of people today would say that it's because of your belief. It's because of how you're structuring, how you think about the world. It's because of how you relate to consensus reality. And I am like an old fogey in the sense of like living in the shift between the Middle Ages and the early modern period. So I'm not about that consensus reality idea or the idea that it's all just belief. To me, it's more that by engaging those things that are slightly off from our regular waking experience but are still there, we pull together that nexus, we pull together that interaction and that relationship more deeply. And so we put one of our feet into their world and we bring one of their feet into our world more strongly. And so it's about the actual function in the relationship, not just that we believe in it and think about it. Because again, that's that negative ego idea. That's that idea that it's about us. It's, yeah, I'm the one that defeated the black and white spirit. It's not my friends and I and my helpers saw the road through to heal our relationship with the black and white spirit. And we want that latter one. We want that one where it's not just about us, where it's about the relationship of everything around us. And if that's the case, it can't be just about our belief. It has to be about how we build that relationship and what the actual functionality of that relationship is. Admiral Zhao captures the moon spirit and the moon eclipses. And so that's again reflecting that idea that there is a direct relationship between what's happening in the spirit world and what's happening in the physical world. Now, for us, it's not always going to be as like crazy obvious as that. You're not going to uh, call on the moon spirit, and the moon spirit's going to come hang out with you, and so the moon's going to eclipse. But interesting trivia thing, in modern witchcraft, where we use the phrase drawing down the moon, we talk about it as you are invoking the moon goddess. It's a possession ritual. We don't always talk about it as a possession ritual, but it's a sort of minor form of possession. And the idea is that the moon is sacred, there's this power to the moon, and so a priestess or an intermediary uh, draws in a piece of the moon goddess, a piece of the moon spirit, to talk to us and interact with us. Drawing down the moon back in the day, the moon did not like that, because it wasn't this positive interaction with the moon. It was, we're witches and we are kind of scary and we're kind of sort of spirits because we're all descended from the sun, because all witches in the Greek world are descended from Helios. And the moon being out at night, that puts too much light out. People will see our rituals, they'll see what we're doing. She'll see what we're doing, and she'll be able to tell people. We're going to pull her out of the sky so there's darkness, and we can work in darkness and be hidden. That's what drawing down the moon was in a Greek context. There's also evidence that there were Irish communities that had a similar ritual, where they would do things to remove the impact of the moon, so that they could work in a more hidden fashion. So a very interesting difference between magic in the ancient world and magic in the modern world. But Admiral Zhao, crazy guy, kind of crappy guy. When he captures the moon, Aang says, "Destroying the moon won't just hurt the water tribe. It will hurt everyone, including you. Without the moon, everything would fall out of balance. You have no idea what kind of chaos that would unleash on the world." The moon is one of the great spirits. The moon's an important factor of the cosmos. I mean, that's true in our world too. If if anyone watched the Magicians, the adaptation of the Lev Grossman book series, they did that in the last season, I think. They like slightly change where the moon is to affect like some spell that's going to mess everything up, and so it destroys like all these things. The world starts falling apart because the moon is like 2 degrees off from where it's supposed to be. Those little changes are something that's of cosmic importance. Could be huge, and so that's a very real concept. But in this case, it's also, again, it's talking about that relational idea, that it's not just about Admiral Zhao being super cool Admiral Zhao and being Zhao the Moonslayer and killing the moon and being like famous for doing that and going down in history. He is like the perfect example of benders detached from the spirit world and detached from spirituality. And like Zhang Zhang describes him that way, talking about how he bends out of anger and without control. Um, the the importance here is that Aang wants him to recognize that the moon isn't just the ally of the water tribe. It's something that everyone has a relationship to, and something that everything else in the world has a relationship to as well. And so by killing that, it's setting everything off balance. I think I just included this line in my notes because I've always loved Iroh's response. But Iroh says, "Whatever you do to that spirit, I'll unleash on you tenfold. Let it go now." And so Iroh is one of the deeply spiritual figures in the series. I hadn't noticed it in times before, but Admiral Zhao mentions that he has heard stories of Iroh's adventures in the spirit world. Iroh is an example that it's not just the Avatar that can go into the spirit world and can have these experiences in the spirit world, but there's even legends about Iroh doing this, which really, basically, Iroh is a sorcerer. Like, they don't ever like quite say that, but the fact that they're like legends and stories and rumors that he's off doing these things with spirits that no one else does, and that we find out later that he's learning from spirits in ways that other people don't. That's basically what would set him apart as a sorcerer in the real world. When Yue says goodbye and Ardnook talks about the vision that he had of a beautiful young woman becoming the moon, then we get that sense again of a continuance of existence beyond bodily existence. And so that goes back to like that idea that it's like we don't describe Princess Yue as being born dead. It's not something that's a matter of she's animate, she's inanimate. It's what condition is she in and what's the relationship that is the result of that condition. And so there's still some relationship that Princess Yue has with the world at this point when she transitions on. And hers is a special transition, obviously. She had a piece of the moon spirit in her, and she goes and she becomes the new moon spirit. But there's that implication that it's not something where it's like you're alive and you're dead. It's that there's a continuity and that there are different phases of existence. And we see that, again, in later seasons and in Korra, where we see Gyatso in the spirit world, and in Korra we see Iroh in the spirit world, and we see Admiral Zhao in the spirit world. Of course, Admiral Zhao is also, I guess, a special example because he got taken into the spirit world by a spirit. So our last segment, and this might actually fit. I tend to run over, but we've got 9 minutes left, only one segment left. Spirit teachers and guides. That's something that we talk about a lot in the real world in communities like this, at events like this. I think sometimes, again, with that reification of things, we talk about our spirit guides, and you see this a lot in like big online forums where it's like people have watched a lot of TikTok but maybe not looked at anything else. And they're like, how do I find my spirit guides? Who's my spirit guide? Okay, is there a spirit that tells you things? Is there a spirit that guides you? Is there a spirit that helps you learn stuff? That's a spirit guide. Like, it's not like a class of spirits. It's not that there is at least in general, in like some things like a spiritismo, I believe there are spirits that are specifically guides there. And so there are going to be some cultures and some traditions that have that. And I am not someone trained in a spiritismo, so I could be incorrect about that. That is my understanding of it, but you have to ask somebody who actually works that system. But in general, it's just there are going to be spirits that help you. There are going to be spirits that teach you. And I was at Devin Hunter's class last night, and he talked about how changes in your life might change who those spirits are that show up for you and who those spirits are that work with you. And personally, I like the spirit court concept better than the spirit guides, that it's, you've got a bunch of buddies. You've got the people you go to the bar with. You've got the people that you go and you sit and you listen respectfully to. You've got the people that you go to for help, and you've got the people who know how to knock heads in the spirit world when you need it. And all of them are part of your crew. They're all the ones that you have some relationship with. And so that's a way to think about it instead of just like, oh, my spirit guides. Because that's also like, that's kind of putting on a pedestal. That's like putting a lot of work on them. Like, is that all they have to do, is just be there to guide you? Is that like what their job is? I don't think so. And Avatar demonstrates this in some interesting ways. Of course, there's the animal teachers that we've talked about a little bit, and we see in later seasons. So we're not going to talk about that more right now. But going back to Heibai, Aang's first spirit flight is because of contact with Heibai. Heibai passes along and brushes Aang, and that pulls Aang's spirit out of his body into the spirit world. And that's something where we can look at traditional cultures and see that same concept. Familiar spirits and other spirit allies have traditionally been spirits that facilitate spirit flight and facilitate that movement into the spirit world. The QR codes in the packet have linked to my blog. There's a very popular post on there about opium and fairies, and dealing with working with a fairy to engage in spirit flight instead of going through all of the modern like Harner shamanism processes of kind of ritually putting yourself in that space. It's just sort of like, hey, bro, can you grab me and dope up my mind and take me once my body's weak? The Benandanti, for those who are familiar with the Benandanti and the Malandanti, the good walkers and the bad walkers in the Friuli region of Italy / the German Empire. They engage in involuntary spirit flight. And that's something like people today think all magic stuff is all voluntary. It's all stuff that you do, and it's all stuff that you go out and you learn. And it's like, prior to 100 years ago, there's a ton of magic that it's like, you were just a magic person, and these things were going to happen to you whether you wanted it or not. And the Benandanti, they have that, where they have almost compulsory spirit flight. There are ways that they can get out of it. But at a certain point in their life, it's just going to start happening. And they're going to hear the drum, and they're going to be pulled out, and their bodies are going to be catatonic while they go on this adventure. And in a lot of examples, it's described that a cat comes and leads them out, or a butterfly comes and leads them out. And sometimes they take the form of the animal as well when they travel, but there's that animal guiding them. In the book Demon Lovers, it talks about how, I enunciated that really poorly, not demon lovers as in like, man, that guy really loves demon. Demon lovers as in you have a lover that's a demon. It talks about how historically it wasn't necessarily believed that witches could fly. It was believed that witches had spirit allies that could fly, and through the process of transvection, those spirit allies could carry the witch. And so you see a lot of examples where witches are described as riding on familiars or riding on animal spirits when they're in spirit flight going to the Sabbath. And so there's that almost same idea where Aang is like, he's basically riding an animal spirit into the spirit world. And later on, in that same episode actually, Aang rides Fang, who at this point is now a spirit ally. And then in the Siege of the North, Heibai carries Aang through the spirit world and sends him back into the physical world. So we see a lot of that where spirit travel is facilitated by these animal allies and these animal helpers in spirit form, or spirit helpers and spirit allies. In terms of animal helpers, obviously, Aang travels around on Appa, and Roku traveled around on Fang. And when Aang meets Fang, he says to him that he was Roku's animal guide the way that Appa is his animal guide. And we don't really see that explored a lot. This is almost like this weird throwaway line, but it's actually deeply important for understanding this relationship. And we see that there's a hugely important relationship between Aang and Appa, particularly in, I think it's in season 2, where there's all the different stories of things happening at Ba Sing Se, and Aang has to save Appa. And I think there it's where he talks about that, like, Appa is like his family. But here there's an implication that that relationship with Appa is part of him learning, part of him either being the Avatar or maybe just part of being a bender, that he has this relationship with this animal. And so it doesn't really matter that the animal's not a spirit, because do we have to have categories? No, we just have to have relationships. And so Aang has that relationship with Appa. Roku had that relationship with Fang. Fang is now passed on to the spirit world, and so Aang and Roku still have that relationship with Fang. And this becomes super useful because Fang communicates things to Aang. He touches Aang and gives him visions. And that's something where, again, like with work with spirits, sometimes that's the communications. You have contact. That contact stimulates things in your mind. Your mind creates the images that you need in order to understand that contact. And so the way you perceive it is subjective, but there's still an objective instigation to it. Fang is the objective instigation, creating these subjective visions in Aang's mind. So that's a very typical depiction of spirit work. Fang helps Aang understand why Haibei is upset and how to deal with it. So Fang's interactions with Aang are part of what initiates Aang into interaction with the spirit world. He's pretty clueless about it before that. He admits it. He talks about how he doesn't know how to be the bridge to the spirit world. He doesn't know what he's supposed to do. He doesn't know how he's going to deal with this Heibai situation. Working with Fang and Roku also leads to Aang meeting Ko the Face Stealer. Ko the Face Stealer is someone where we probably wouldn't naturally think of them as an ally or a helper. Like, Ko's intentionally scary. He's intentionally creepy. But we don't have categories. Creepy and scary doesn't mean that they can't be a helper. Like, that's the thing we always talk about with kids, that like we need to teach kids that just because something's different, or just because someone's different, or just because there's something that seems frightening about them on the surface, that doesn't mean that they're bad. And just because someone seems like they're exactly what we would expect or seems to fit a standard of beauty, that doesn't mean that they're good. I mean, in Ko's case, Ko is kind of messed up, but he is somewhat adversarial. But that's also like a really cool thing about this show. Almost no one, except maybe the Cabbage Dude, almost no one is a one-note character. So there is some dynamism to Ko also. And in terms of whether he's an ally or not, yeah, it's an antagonistic interaction that Aang has with him initially. Aang has to make sure he's not having any kind of expression. He's not showing any kind of emotion. He's got to be very controlled, which for like, what is he, 10, 11? Like, that's super tough, even if you grew up as a monk. But Aang goes to Ko in order to learn the information about the spirit world that he needs. And in that way, Ko is still a spirit teacher. He's still a guide. He's an ally. He's not, if someone's like, how do I find my spirit guides? No one wants to go find the face stealer. And that's a good illustration of how spirit guide doesn't have to mean like it's this role that this spirit performs. It's a spirit that's helping you, giving you some information in a particular moment. And so Aang goes, he gets the knowledge about the spirit world that Ko has. That also illustrates the idea that sometimes there's going to be knowledge, particularly about the lore of the spirit world, about the interactions, the history of the spirit world, the relationships we have with spirits, that spirits will have that we don't necessarily have ourselves, even if that spirit might otherwise be antagonistic. Sometimes we have to navigate interactions with antagonistic spirits. And so that takes us right up to the end of season 1. And so it also takes us right up to the end of this class. So there are a lot of really cool things we can reflect on about animism from Avatar. For some people, maybe it is learning about those things from that are depicted in Avatar and learning about animism from that. For some people, it might be that we kind of know about animism, but if we really dig into this and really dig into how it plays out, we can understand a little bit more about how to live animistically and how to engage animism, engage an animistic world without the sort of artificial structuralisms that we might try to force upon that otherwise by making it overly intellectual. So I'm going to end there. I